and welcome to Mindscapes, our series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today trained as a clinical psychologist and a sociologist, but he's today widely regarded and recognized as one of India's preeminent social theorists. His work is distinguished by his erudition and nuanced insights into what are seemingly everyday experiences and everyday events, everyday processes, and bringing them and making them accessible with his academic, intellectual rigor to a larger community. I'm delighted to welcome Ashis Nandy. Ashish, you trained as a clinical psychologist and a sociologist, and now you're widely regarded as a social theorist. You write on a whole range of issues, from cricket to cinema to violence to you name it. What personally for you is your most overriding concern?
Well, let me put it this way. I think I have consistently, despite the apparent range of my concerns, focused on a very narrow set of concerns. And this set primarily centers on human nature in all its complexity, and particularly human nature as it influences, shapes, or limits our public life. That is why during the last 5 years or so I have begun to call myself a political psychologist, because it is the borderlines of public life and human consciousness, and if I may add it, unconsciousness, that really interests me.
What are these sort of common denominators that enable a social psychologist, if I may sort of describe it that way, to look at what are really a group or sums of totals of individuals? How do you begin to assess a group psychology? What is it that gives a group a psychology in a sense?
Look, many people will focus directly on the groups. The behavior and the predispositions of the aggregate interest them. In my case, I always focus on how certain processes outside the person, in the society, in politics, in culture, gets telescoped into his or herself, how they are internalized and processed. That has been my concern. So in that sense and at that plane, my interest still remains, or at least my unit of analysis remains the person. But through the person, I see the community, the country, perhaps even the world. He or she epitomizes our times, and I want to capture that.
Perhaps the most, one of the graphic illustrations of this process is the individual reacting or responding to shall I say, the imperatives, the implications, the opportunities, the possibilities, the influences of globalization, of the opening up, in a sense, of India, of an access, of an exposure to a larger set of cultural influences than the average Indian, shall we say, whatever the average Indian is, had been influenced to for several decades. A fairly closed economy, of a fairly insulated country. What kind of influences, what kind of impact do you see that happening on, well, shall we say, relationships between people, on the increasing culture of violence that we see, of what we perceive as a greater pursuit of consumer and of wealth? In what ways do you see this playing itself out?
I disagree with you that this is the first instance of globalization that Indians are getting exposed to. After all, in the last century, we have gone through 2 world wars. What were these world wars? The so-called world wars were, if they were not global. We have gone through colonization over the last 400 years. What were they, if not global in their scope? But after saying that, I would agree with you on the tacit part of your question. I do see the violence in India's cities, particularly metropolitan cities, increasing dramatically over the next few years, because this globalization might mean different things to different people. It might give certain kinds of opportunities which it did not have. It might even have remedied certain kind of ills that were there in the Indian political economy. But nonetheless, this globalization also allows a form of consumption for which there was no precedent in Indian society. I have seen in the earlier generation of many of India's business families that the patriarchs lived very simply and very frugally. Their own children and grandchildren now live differently. In fact, I have a suspicion they think that their grandparents probably were stingy or did not know how to live well. And in a poor country, where about 1/3 of the country can have no access to the items of consumption you value so much, you will not value it after a few years, but at the moment you do. And after a few years you would not value because everybody will have them. But at the moment you do. But in any case, this creates such a barrier and it's such a temptation to the others that I do see the crime rates going up very quickly in the large cities certainly, but even in the smaller cities in India already. The security of the elderly in the city of Delhi is atrocious. And if you look into the cases, read them carefully in the newspapers, you will find invariably or almost invariably it is some domestic help who has collaborated with the assault on them. And my suspicion is this, that this is partly because even the wealth and the money which you think you have justifiably earned and justifiably spending on yourself does not enjoy the same legitimacy in the people you employ. Your driver, your cook, your security guard thinks that if you are spending money in this fashion, you are probably either a crook or a cheat. Yeah. And they have as much right to the money as you have, and they have a right to collaborate with other crooks to eliminate you, to get a share of the booty.
What sort of other psychologically, or a social psychologist, this is bred of a sense of, as you've said, illegitimacy of wealth, and the perception that the wealth that you and I may have is somehow illegitimate. This inequity, what are the other kind of forces that this is likely to yield? Most of the international reports in India, the recent Asian Development Bank report, says that even at growth rates of 7%, we will still have in the year 2020 we will still have 1/3 of the population far below the poverty line. So this aspect of inequity is something that we're going to have to live with.
I am less worried about the inequity part of it. India has lived with inequity and survived it. It is bad. It should be reduced. My suspicion is this, instead of getting reduced, it will increase. But for the moment, I don't think that is a major problem. People are willing to tolerate a lot of inequity if they have the means and the wherewithals of survival. And I'm afraid this globalization will truly push them to the wall. I won't be surprised if something like 10 to 15% of the Indian population ultimately are kind of tacitly accepted as obsolete and redundant and just left to die out on their own outside the range of vision of people like you and me.
I think one of the reactions of that has been that we see the increasing ghettoization in some ways, in other ways we increasingly isolate ourselves from that reality or the experience of those people. Look at the colonies that we live in. We now have large gates that tend to exclude the less privileged. We tend to have our own generators for our electricity, our own subsoil wells for water supply. There is this increasing divide happening even in urban Delhi, held out to be a city where the Delhi government says that nobody earns less than 2,000 rupees a month. It has amongst the highest per capita incomes in the country.
Yes, you are absolutely right. I mean, I can add to your list. We drink mineral water. We don't travel by train, we travel by plane. We don't use ordinary post, we use speed post. We don't use ordinary telephones, we use cell phones. It goes on and on. Gradually, the world of the upper middle class and the rich are getting separated from the world of the lower middle class and the poor.
What are the social implications of this? Is there going to be sort of a waking up, a revolt in the Marxist sense perhaps, of people who have been deprived their share of...
No, I think they will live on the new opiates of the masses, so to speak. The television, religious fervor, gurus, the national sport called politics, and so on and so forth. I do not see a rebellion brewing in India, but I do see that apart from the people who are talking about who will be left behind, there is a small sector consisting primarily of the tribals and the former untouchables and the Atishudras, so to speak, who will perhaps be wiped out by the process of globalization over the next 10 to 15 years.
What do you mean wiped out? Will they be sort of lose their identities because they will be integrated? They will get into other subgroups? What do you mean by wiped out?
Yes, partly that kind of thing, but it's more dangerous than you think. I mean, already out of the 250 odd tribes of India, reportedly 1/3 have been totally uprooted. Now they gravitate towards the urban slum and constitute a kind of a floating mass of people who are kind of carry a heavy load of violence within, and that violence is looking for targets. The violence is prior, the causes of violence are subsequent.
You have written extensively on marginalized communities. Do we tend to just sort of have a romanticized notion of the value of their traditional wisdom, of the need to empower that traditional wisdom? What innate value is there a value in a sense of saying, well, this has been your tradition, this has been centuries and generations of practice, a way of living, a way of looking at the world, and let us preserve it for its own sake. We have
look, I think the question is wrongly put. Many people raise this question with me, and they would love to hear me contradict them. But I think the question should be put another way. It is not that somebody is trying to romanticize these marginal communities, but human society has always been diverse and plural. And virtually every human society has shown that if after a point of time you push certain kinds of values, certain kind of culture to the exclusion of others, and build a monolithic culture, that somehow or other after a point of time fails to meet the challenges of the time, and then you are left with nothing else. There is no alternative within the society on which you can fall back. Look at the world's second largest superpower, Soviet Union, which was at one time seen as the future of the world. Because they marginalized and cornered every kind of dissent, every kind of diversity, because they tried to steamroll the differences within, ultimately they ended up with a system and a culture, a monolithic system and a monolithic culture, which facing new kinds of challenges from global capitalism, collapsed pathetically, collapsed with a whimper, didn't even resist the collapse. And that's what happens in the case of virtually every culture which turns itself into a monolithic whole. Diversity is an end in itself. Whether that diversity ensures that the marginalized have a touch of wisdom or not, whether that marginal groups have systems of knowledge or skills which are socially worthwhile or not, that diversity itself is crucial.
The strength of India's plurality has been its ability to sort of, in a sense, assimilate diverse influences that have entered India. Somehow at the time of independence and the years after that, unity and diversity was the sort of big buzzword, sort of pointing to the idea that somehow at the apex of diversity was a single truth, or was a single common goal. Do you see a pattern in Indian society and its response to these diverse influences?
Well, India has always celebrated diversity. 20,000 castes, 2,000 varieties of Brahmins. We talk of the Brahmin as if it is a unitary caste. Well, there are 2,000 varieties of Brahmins who do not intermarry and often do not dine with each other. Some 25 national languages. According to surveys, 1,800 languages. Perhaps as many as 5,000 to 6,000 communities, 15% of which have supposed to have more than one religion even. This is the nature of our diversity. We have lived with diversity for centuries. Now when we talked of unity in diversity, it was basically seen as a compromise with unity. We couldn't shed the diversity and we couldn't gulp it. So the hope was this, that it was unity and in diversity at this point of time. In future it will be unity in unity. I'm afraid that option was never open to us, and it is certainly not open to us now. I think India's strength was its diversity. Its strength was that it did not depend on a unitary concept of nationality or a unitary state to give its diversity a certain configurative principle which allowed this diversity to make a meaningful whole. That diversity made sense to the people who lived with that diversity. They could communicate despite the diversity. In fact, they could communicate better because of the diversity. And that was the richness of India. We never truly appreciated it because our concept of state and our concept of the nation was borrowed entirely from the colonial experience, 19th century Europe. And 19th century Europe, we thought, was the last word in human civilization. And if you notice carefully, all our political parties, all our ideological stand from the extreme right to the extreme left operate only on the basis of an European concept of nation and European concept of state. Even those who talk of an Islamic state or a Hindu state never genuinely have examined what was the nature of a Hindu state, what was the nature of an Islamic state.
What was the nature of a Hindu state?
That state allowed differential loyalties from different sectors of the population. So did, incidentally, the Islamic states in India. In other words, you might like to be integrated very much into the state and the state system, others might like to be integrated much less. And this difference was allowed. There was no debate about Article 370 and autonomy. Every different entity within a state system, within an empire, had different relationship with the state. That was one of the first characteristics. Second characteristic was this, that the state never claimed to set the pace of life for the ordinary citizens. It ensured you security, but didn't try to educate you, didn't try to be the first principle of social progress, didn't try to claim anything other than reasonable amount of loyalty to, in exchange of which you are provided some degree of security. They didn't provide that well, but their demands also were very much less.
I'm going to sort of jump from this very interesting strand of our conversation to another area of interest. You have written on cricket, you have written on cinema, and I think there's sort of almost a national anguish today about what has happened with the cricket scandal, the betting on cricket, the corruption of national icons in a sense. What do you see this representative of?
Frankly, I never tried to write on cricket. I'm not a specialist on cricket. I love the game, but that's about all. I wrote a book on cricket mainly to articulate certain political and psychological concerns, a worldview. Because I am not trained in philosophy, because I am not trained in political theory, I thought that the metaphor of cricket, the trope of cricket, will allow me to say certain things which I cannot say directly. Ultimately, I am not an academic, I am merely an intellectual. And it is in that context that I would like to affirm that I find the present sense of anguish and hysteria about match fixing almost vulgar. Politicians whose own mothers will not trust them with 10 rupees are advising the cricketers on morality. And what is this match fixing? It is alleged that this World Wrestling Federation, which organizes this American freestyle wrestling, they have all the matches fixed, not 90%, not 95%, but 100% of the matches are fixed. Nobody bothers about it. It is because in our sense of impotency, in our sense of failure, in response to our failure to achieve according to our own standards, we have been driven by our feelings of insecurity in investing in these young cricket players in their 20s and 30s, the national ambitions and the national hopes and aspirations. We expect them to do what our politicians and business people cannot do. Our politics and our business is riven with corruption. Millions of rupees worth of corruption. Everybody knows about them. We cannot do anything about this corruption. So we are after these young boys in their 20s and 30s because we think they should be made a lesson out of. We should make a lesson out of them. Frankly, they might have been tempted. It is bad enough. I am not supporting match fixing. But to tell them, say for instance, not to play cricket till the things are cleared up is absurd, because their careers is not more than 15 years at most. Right. Their situation is very much like the film stars. Film stars also have a very small career, and they are constantly subjected to threats from income tax officers and FERA officials and enforcement department people. I mean, let them go after the larger sharks first. I will be convinced that they are genuinely against corruption.
You've just described yourself as an intellectual in preference to an academic. What is an intellectual? What is his role in society? What do you see as your role as an intellectual?
I think my job is to create and keep open options for this civilization. I see my job as to create possibilities open for the next generation, so that they do not mechanically gulp what comes to them as authoritative voices, authoritative texts, and look with a bit of skepticism towards what they otherwise might have revered. I believe that the ultimate value of an intellectual is a certain analytic attitude, an attempt to analyze threadbare the popular slogans and popular mythologies of our times, particularly those that are held by the powerful and the rich. I am willing to criticize a palmist who might cheat you of 20 rupees by promising to tell you your future, but I will do so after I have criticized those who are trying to cheat you of 20 billion rupees by way of selling you props to eternal youth in the form of new kinds of cosmetics and new kinds of tonics. I think the intellectual's job is to examine the superstitions and the irrationalities of the powerful and the rich first, and then look for the superstitions and irrationalities of the poor and the humble.
Ashish Nandi, thank you very much. That's been a great